Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast, Our New Narrative with Andre Davis, and today I'm presenting episode 6 in a series that I have titled Things I Wish I Also Learned in February. And the title for today's episode is Shocking Revelations About the Origins of African American Culture. And basically the subject is it really a black thing? And I want to get started with a quote from one of my favorite authors and one of America's most influential citizens, Mr. Frederick Douglass, back there looking very dignified above me, this way, in the background. So I'm quoting from his book, which goes as follows. It was in this dull, flat, and thrifty district or neighborhood, burdened by the Choptank River, among the laziest and muddiest of streams, surrounded by a white population of the lowest order, indolent and drunken to a proverb, and among slaves who, in point of ignorance and indolence, were fully in accord with their surroundings, that I, without any fault of my own, was born and spent the first years of my childhood. Now, that's from The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, originally published in 1881. Now, the geographics of that story may have changed, but not much else has, right? Frederick Douglass, along with other slaves, going all the way back to when the first slave stepped on American soil, were surrounded by primarily poor whites and the culture that they brought with them from England. And so we're going to take, with that as our backdrop, we're going to go into a little, just I guess, demographics. And this is coming from one of my other favorite books, The History of Slavery, written by William Blake, and that was written in 1857. You can check, I have plenty of other podcasts where that book is up on the screen, so if you want to check that out, feel free to do so. So, the first, as you all know, the first slaves landed in 1619, and by 1688, about half of the blacks in America were born on American soil. And by 1861, that's the Civil War, 99% of blacks in America were born in America. This is just illustrating the disconnection of various African cultures from the people of African descent at that time. And if you don't have a calculator, 1861 was about 159 years ago. So we've been, there's an ocean of time between me and the cultures currently alive and well on the continent of Africa. So I'm going to go back. Now I'm going to go into a book that you see above me, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. I know a lot of you out there love this guy. If you don't know who he is, just Google him. He's a national treasure, economist, world renowned. But he does write on basically how, in my opinion, how economics affects race and society. But anyway, I want to quote from his book. Now, he's identifying rednecks and crackers, but not as an insult. He identifies I guess, a demographic of people as rednecks and crackers, but this is not an insult. This is actually just this is what they were called back in England, so it's just an identifier, I guess I should say. Okay, so quote, what the rednecks or crackers brought with them across the ocean was a whole constellation of attitudes, values, and behavior patterns that might have made sense in the world in which they had lived for centuries, but which would prove to be counterproductive to the blacks who, would live in their midst for centuries before emerging into freedom and migrating to great urban centers of the United States, taking with them similar values. So the point of that is basically, if you think of Braveheart, the movie with Mel Gibson, right? You're talking about cultures that go back, 1100 AD. And they, what worked for them in that time period really worked for them. I mean, for better or worse, right? But they found when they immigrated into, let's say, America's northern states, a more industrialized community and economy and environment, you can't have a bunch of Bravehearts running around New Hampshire, right? So they had to be, in order for that culture to be successful in America, they decided that, hey, okay, some of this stuff just not going to work. We need to get with the program and adapt to the situation at hand. Well, that worked for them, but for some reason, African Americans are still holding on to a lot of those cultural traits. And we don't even realize that is not our cultural traits. It's a borrowed traits from another culture that we refuse to let go of. So I'm going back into the book here. Quote, the cultural values and social patterns prevalent among Southern whites included an aversion to work, proneness to violence, neglect of education, sexual promiscuity, imprudence, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, a reckless search for entertainment, lively music and dance, and a style of religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. This oratorial style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and had continued on into our own times among Black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from regions of Britain, quote, where the civilization was the least developed, quote, end quote. They boast and lack self-restraint. Olmsted said after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. So, when I was growing up, young kid in Detroit in the 70s, 80s, I'm speaking for myself, but I feel free to speak for those around me. I could care less about education. We fought all the time. Sex was in the air. There was always a reckless search for entertainment, lively music and dance. Nothing wrong with this stuff. This is just identifying the cultural traits, right? A style of religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric. We've all been to church, right? So this didn't originate with us. We kind of adapted it and borrowed it. And what the point of this is, if some of these attributes are holding our community back from being more successful, it's okay to let some of this stuff go, right? And then in the section of the book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, by Thomas Sowell, under the section Pride and Violence, I'm quoting here, centuries before Black pride became a fashionable phrase, there was cracker pride. And it was very much the same kind of pride. It was not pride in any particular achievement or set of behavioral standards or moral principles adhered to. It was instead a touchiness about anything that might be even remotely construed as a personal slight, much less an insult, combined with a willingness to erupt into violence over it. And we all seen Do the Right Thing, where, my man steps on my man's white Nikes and he's like, I'm gonna kick your bloop. So, and growing up in Detroit, that happened all the time. I remember going through the mall, you couldn't hold eye contact with people without a fight almost erupting over nothing, literally. So I'm very familiar with these attributes, right? And out of this book, he gives details about Black English. And I'm quoting here. From the same regions of England came such words as yaller for yellow, axe for ask, across for across, y'all for you, boil for boil, do for door, dis for this, dat for that, and many of these usages have long since died out in England, though the word chitlins for hog entrails continue to be used in some localities in England, even in the 20th century. As such usage remained common among Black Americans. So, surprise, we didn't get chitlins from Africa; it came from England, and it didn't. We didn't even get it from the antebellum South. It actually came. They were eating chitlins in England before anybody even stepped on American soil. So, to continue here, but no such words came from Africa, like I said, and nor did the holiday Kwanzaa, which originated in Los Angeles. Now, the slaves' custom of making their marriages or marking their marriages by jumping over a broomstick, a custom resurrected at posh weddings among Blacks in the 20th century in New York and across the country, I believe, as a mark of racial identity, was in fact a pagan custom in Europe in centuries past and survived for a long time among Southern whites. So jumping a broom didn't originate in Africa. It didn't originate in the Southern colonies during slavery. It was a pagan ritual that originated in Europe centuries before America was even founded. Okay, so it's okay to jump the broom. You should just know its origin. Okay, so you may ask yourself, Andre, what's your point? The point is, like I said, many attributes that are prevalent in modern day urban African American communities are not African, and more importantly, they don't work well in a free market society. You got to have skills. In order to have skills in the 21st century, you need education. But, what type of education? Education that's going to provide you with skills that other people are willing to pay for, like computer science degree or engineering degree. I digress. But the cultures where these attributes originated, this is what's important. They figured out it's time to get rid of these things so we can be successful. So, and if you just want to do a simple comparison, compare modern day African migrants to America or immigrants to America with those of African descent who've been in America for centuries. Those Africans who have recently immigrated to America were never exposed nor adopted any of those unsuccessful cultural attributes that the English brought with them. Some of the English brought with them to America. So, with that said, I'm going to, I guess spend a little bit more time on something I found that was pretty interesting. It was the colony of Georgia. If you don't know, Georgia was founded as a free colony, and it was primarily founded for the yeoman class of poor whites. They didn't want slavery in Georgia. Georgia was basically used kind of as a buffer between South Carolina, a slave colony, and the territory of Florida, where you had a lot of slaves would escape to Florida from South Carolina, and they would go back into South Carolina and free other slaves and bring them back down to Georgia. Back down to Florida. Well, Georgia was formed kind of as a buffer, and you had a lot of people from the Scottish Highlands to come in and act as a barrier, a military barrier between the South Carolina and Florida, protecting other people's property at the time, which were slaves, right? But the people who lived in Georgia, the poor whites, didn't want slavery there because it just interferes with their income and all of that. But eventually the slave oligarchy got their way, and they ushered in slavery into Georgia, but with two interesting conditions that directly relate to what I consider attributes of modern day African American culture. And I'm reading from the book I mentioned earlier, The History of Slavery by William Blake. It was written in 1857. So in 1750, on condition all masters under a mullet of 5 pounds, I'm sorry, that's 1750, on the condition that all masters under a mullet of 5 pounds should be obliged to compel their Negroes to attend at some time on the Lord's Day for instruction in the Christian religion, the origins, doubtless, of the particularly religious character of the Negroes in and about Savannah. So in order for the slave oligarchy to have slavery in Georgia, the requirement was all slave owners had to take all their slaves to church, right? Masters were forbidden to allow their slaves to hire their own time, or hire any plantation, to possess any vessel or boat, to keep or raise any horses, cattle, hog, to engage in any sort of trade on their own account, to be taught to write or to have or wear any apparel except livery servants, so basically the servants who were in the house. They couldn't have any apparel finer than Negro cloth. And they give examples of Duras, kerseys, blue linen, check linen, coarse garlics, calicos, checkered cotton, or Scotch plaid. Anyone seeing a Negro better cladded than what the law allowed could seize the clothes, could basically strip them naked, right? And so you can imagine once these laws were repealed, how happy the newly emancipated was to be able to express themselves with clothes. So I can definitely see that. I grew up with Henry the Hatter in Detroit. When we go to prom, we can just get crazy with it. Now this stuff, for good or bad, I'm not making a judgment call here. I'm just showing you where it originates from. And now I'll end you with that. And like all these other episodes, I'm going to leave a link to a website that provides a ton of information on organizations that are currently fighting the fight against slavery around the world, not just sex trafficking, but also slavery for physical labor. So if you want to do more than just complain about what happened to other people in the past, and get involved with what's going on today, I'll provide the link for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and continue to look out for the next episode. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.